Welcome to another episode of The Zen Curious. I'm Kiera Hanselman, and today Lauren and I are going to be exploring the rich and sometimes messy landscape of emotions. We're going to talk about what it means to feel emotions deeply and why some emotions are more difficult to express and how our conditioning can shape the way we handle them. Together, we're going to share some techniques for navigating intense feelings with more grace and understanding. And we'll discuss the role that emotional intelligence plays in helping us find balance and peace. So if you want to take your practice a step further, be sure to join us on our free 7-day awareness challenge, which includes exercises to help you tune into your emotions and connect more fully with yourself. The journey starts now. This is The Zen Curious. All right. We are back. Yeah. And today we are going to be talking about emotions.
Yeah. So as we become aware, we start to feel more, right? Both in our physical body, but also in our emotional body. And a lot of us have been defaulting to what Paul Ekman terms as our 6 basic emotions, which is happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust. And so if we can trace back our earliest memories, we could probably correlate it to one of these 6 emotions. Yet what we know, and as we start to bring awareness to our being, is there's so much more depth in the human experience, or what's coined as emotional intelligence, that we're able to have an experience of in this lifetime.
Yeah, when I think about emotions, there is so many times that it's really difficult to describe what I'm feeling.
Sure.
I would even say that for me, especially in the beginning of my journey, there wasn't even 6 emotions, right? Like happiness, fear, sadness, anger.
Yep.
And then within those 4, what feels safe to express. I know many of us grew up stop crying, don't cry, I'll give you something to cry about, that type of thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so to feel sadness or disappointment or any of those things that create that vulnerability feels unsafe, right? And so for me, my default in those moments is anger, because that's a much safer emotion for me. It doesn't feel as scary, because if I get to be scary, then I am not scared. Or I don't know. This is a big one, I think, and not only just being able to be aware of what the different feelings are, but acknowledging that as humans we experience all of them, and then being able to voice that, give voice to what that feeling is. It's really difficult if you don't know what they are.
Sure. And ultimately our emotions, right, by definition is energy in motion.
Yep.
Right? And so we're meant to feel these experiences of the different energies and allow them to move through us. And so sometimes, to your point, they're not necessarily need to be named or described. They're meant to be felt. Right? And so it's so interesting when you listen to people talk, really listen to them talk. You can tell who your feelers are, because they'll talk about I feel like versus I think that. Right? And so those people can probably touch into those emotions versus the ones that are more logical in their head and they're talking about I think. Right? The mind has control over the energy that's actually in emotion in our bodies. And so if I particularly, you said yours is anger, mine's sadness. I'm really fucking good at being sad.
Yeah.
Which is why I feel like I experience a lot of grief in my life. And when I had done this personal development weekend with Preston Smiles and Alexi Panos. It's called the Bridge Experience. And one of the 2 weekends that we did, we had this rage exercise. And we all got to smack the shit out of a pillow with a tennis racket. And so I went up there and I was like getting my anger out at the guy I was dating at the time. And then it turned into my mother, which I didn't realize I actually had anger at my mother. And then it turned into anger at myself. And then it turned into me crying. And so even with my anger, underneath the anger was this feeling of sadness.
Yeah.
You know, and so we're complex humans, and a lot of times it's multifaceted in terms of the emotions that we're experiencing, but there tends to be a default to one of those 6.
Yeah. I have always believed this. Let me rephrase that. I haven't always believed this. I have probably in the last 5 to 7 years become aware that very rarely is my anger actually anger. Anger is a secondary emotion pretty much 100% of the time. There's something that underlies the anger, right? There's something going on that's creating this this feeling of anger. A lot of times for me, it's this sense of injustice. Some type of injustice is occurring. And that evokes anger in me. Now, it could be an injustice against me. It could be an injustice against the greater society. But that is, when I look at my anger and observe it, that's usually what it is. A betrayal of some kind or something that I perceive as that. Yeah. You know, that's so even looking at our emotions, what's a primary emotion versus a secondary emotion? Like, is there something else giving voice to the anger or the sadness? Or most of the time the answer is yes.
Right. It's interesting because it's like it's the primary emotion, but is injustice, right? I'm feeling injustice and therefore I exemplify anger. So, you know, in my mind in some ways, and maybe I don't know enough to even speak to this, but it's like the anger is the primary because it's the default, right? Even though there's injustice, that's the primary. Oh, yeah. It's like that's the triggering emotion, and then it's like I express it through anger.
Yeah.
Right? And, you know, how else would something like injustice be expressed if it wasn't anger?
Yeah. That's a good question.
Yeah. Like rebellion and power and like, you know, like I could see all of those being aspects of this greater wheel of emotion, right? So if I feel like something's being done, injustice to your child, like how
that's a great way to get me riled up.
Right? And so it's like, okay, I can go at this and meet the same injustice probably with what it was, like some type of anger or bullying or something, right? I have this example. Actually, it's around my story of like being beautiful. And I was in 3rd grade on the bus. I don't think this is going to come up at all, but I was in 3rd grade on the bus, and I took the bus home, and there was a boy that was in 6th grade, and he called me ugly. And I showed up crying to my doorstep with my mom, and my mom was pissed. She got me in the car, she went to the boy's house, and she started yelling at the boy, right? So his bullying turned into her bullying, and now they're meeting the same energy, right? Instead of it being like injustice for my kid, like let me go and like have an empowerment conversation with the parent to figure out like how do we like teach the boy like what he was doing.
Yeah.
You know? And so a lot of times we're having these visceral reactions, right? So there's the somatic reaction that happens in our body, like the soma feels something, right?
Yep.
Our physical being, the soma. It could be psychological. All of a sudden, like now I'm having the thoughts that I'm not pretty. And this has been a story that I've carried with me throughout most of my life. Like I'm not pretty enough.
Yeah.
From this one reaction on the bus.
Yeah.
Right? And then there's the behavioral one. Because I don't feel pretty enough, like I might have an emotional eating thing.
Yep.
To keep myself safe from not having to be pretty, I'll just eat and be overweight or something to that effect, right?
Yep.
And so, you know, looking at these emotions and how they start to show up in the body in the psychology, in the behaviors. Like we know that all of our choice points come from how we're feeling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. And all of our behavior has a reason and a story behind it.
Sure. Sure. And so, as we start to become aware, what we, at least in my personal experience, began to recognize is I actually have greater depth and access to things outside of those 6, right? Outside of happiness, I can also have excitement. Outside of fear, I could have anxiety, and so now all of a sudden the spectrum gets larger because I'm able to name things at different intensities that are based off of these kind of like 6 baselines is how I see them, right?
Yeah.
And so then it's like, and knowing this, then what?
Right. What do you do with that information? How does it help us? How does it help us on our journey to find more peace in our lives?
Yeah. Well, and I think too, it's like, it's an access point to choice, right? So again, like just talking about some of the grief that I've been going through. And one day I woke up and I was like, happiness is a choice. Like I want to choose to be happy. So how do I, again, put into practices into place that allow me to be happy? So maybe I find some gratitude, right? And now it's like, okay, now I can see the universe working for me. In regards to like the beauty story, it's like, I've been doing this thing where I tell myself in the mirror, looking in the mirror, right? I love you. I love you. I love you 10 times. And it's like, oh, all of a sudden, like you start to see the beauty come through and like it evokes a smile. And maybe there's like a feeling of radiance that starts to come through and like your body poises differently, which allows your behaviors to be differently, which allows your body somatically to show up in like in its radiance, like, which is very different than crippling in collapse, right?
Yeah.
And being like, oh no, I'm not beautiful enough.
Right.
Right. And so it's so interesting to watch how like these micro shifts in like the emotions that are running through our current, through our body, flowing through us, start to dictate how we show up in our own reality.
Yeah. I have you seen the movie Inside Out or Inside Out 2?
I don't think I have.
Okay. I love those movies because they really do a great job of illustrating what feeling emotions are like what's happening in our head, and then how that looks outside of our body. I mean, especially the second Inside Out movie, because it starts to introduce the idea that you can feel 2 things at one time. And I think that's a really tough one for people, to be happy about something, but also know that, there's a sense of sadness about it, to be excited, but also, a little bit of anxiety or fear. We don't, again, we talk about this a lot, but we don't exist in black and white. And so part of the beauty and the struggle in the being a sentient being is that we get to feel all the things. I think a lot of times we think, or let's just say I personally beat myself up a lot about, well, I should just be happy. I should just be happy. Well, I can be happy, but I can also be other things. Yeah. All of the feelings, all of the emotions get to be here. And I think when we push away stuff that we're feeling and try to make it not so, it really wreaks havoc on the body. It really wreaks havoc in the mind. And it really creates less peace and more dissatisfaction, dis-ease in the body, because we're not allowing it to move through us, what we're feeling.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the dis-ease, right? You break down the word D-I-S and ease, like not having ease in our body. And so a lot of it is, like you're saying, like stuffing the emotions and not allowing them to be processed fully or fully expressed or fully emoted or felt, right? And so for me as an overthinker, it's like I always try and make sense of my feelings instead of just feeling the feelings. And what does it need, And so the past 7 or 8 years that I've been doing my personal work, it's like when I get mad, I used to have a pool noodle and I'd go smack the shit out of something in my backyard, you know, like whether it was the side of my house or like just to express rage. And I realized, like, again, like underneath this deep sadness, just like I had in that exercise, like I went in with rage, but I defaulted to sadness because it was familiar and comfortable, and being angry wasn't okay. And so now when I get upset, one, I like to write a shit ton of fuck you letters. Like I've been saying fuck you to some people in my life on a daily basis, sometimes twice a day in those letters right now.
Great practice, by the way. You don't ever actually have to send the letter, but you get out the emotion, you get to let it move through you.
Because the conscious mind and the subconscious mind, like there's no differentiating. It's just the act of being in motion, right? So there's that. There's the pool noodle smacking. There's been plenty of times where I've been screaming into either a pillow in my house, or oftentimes I did it on the drive up here.
In the car?
In the car. I was like, I was pissed. I was pissed because of the hurricane. I was pissed because of my relationship. I was like, and it was like, I don't want to keep this in my body. So what do I have to do to let it out? Like a freaking primal scream. Like, why not?
Talking about,
you know,
absolutely.
Like, and so it's like not only like identifying the emotion, like allowing it to be in its full expression.
Yeah. For women, I think it's a very challenging thing, right? We're either too much or not enough. Particularly as it relates to our emotion in professional settings. We're either too soft, or we get labeled as a bitch, aggressive.
Right.
Oh my goodness. If I could tell you some of the things that have been said on performance evaluations that have been given to me by men, by the way, who are equally as assertive, but it gets called assertive for them and aggressive for women. I mean, it's really difficult. We've grown up, most of us, in an environment where we've been trained to not speak up. We've been trained, or if we do speak up, we will receive, harsh feedback for it, or crying. If you cry at work, but I mean, people cry, right?
I was crying in the restaurant the other day. The manager came over the table to ask how everything was. My girlfriend was holding my hand because I was just going through it, and he's like, "Oh, like I don't even know how to how's
People
dinner?
don't.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna run away because I have no idea what's going on." Like, and what an opportunity to again meet somebody with compassion. Like, it looks like you're having a rough day. Can I bring you dessert on the house?
Yeah.
How do we actually tap into somebody who's being in their vulnerable space? And what I recognize, I help co-facilitate a ton of ceremonies, plant medicine ceremonies. And one of the things that we do is set intention. So as part of this exercise or our conversation today, what I want to bestow upon you is, in the morning, one of the practices that I often do is, before I pick up my phone and scroll, which oftentimes does not happen on a regular basis, but, taking a moment, putting my hands on my chest and having the intention of what do I want to feel today? How do I want to operate in my day? Do I want it to be in gratitude? Do I want it to be in love? Do I want it to be in service? Do I want it to be in joy? Do I want it to be in clarity and confidence and courageousness? We get to choose how we get to show up. And just that one exercise alone will really help set the precedence of what we can actually encounter in our days. And so, again, with plant medicine ceremony, we do the same thing, right? So most of us are going there for healing. We want to heal something or allow healing to happen through us, because really, I believe that we can move all the energy if we actually allow it to flow. And so a lot of times what will happen is we'll start with an intention setting. And most people are superficial. I want clarity and where I'm supposed to do the next thing. It's no, we got to look at how do we pull out the root of the problem and address it. And so what we'll see is if there is one person that opens up, one person in the beginning of the circle that really becomes vulnerable enough to face off with their shit and share their deepest fears, it allows space for everybody else to do the same. And so again, if it's energy, it can't be created nor destroyed, right? We can transmute it, we can witness it. And so how do we be the example for people in the world to help, at least in my story of like, why am I here on this planet? It's like to create a ripple of healing and for humanity.
Yeah.
And a lot of that will only happen if I'm willing to do the work myself.
Yeah. It is so true that the more honest and vulnerable we can each be on an individual level, it gives other people permission to do the same.
Yeah.
And that's such an important thing to be a model of for others, because it does feel in most situations really unsafe.
Yeah.
To be raw and like, if I show this side of me, no one will ever love me. No one will ever want to be my friend.
Right.
No one will ever fill in the blank.
Right. Or it's the story of too muchness, right?
Yeah.
Then I'm too much. People can't handle me. All of those things. I think like just spending time with you and your family the last couple of days has been like, what a beautiful example you are for like letting them call you out on your shit sometimes. Like, hey, Mom, I see you. And you're like, you know what? You're right.
Yeah.
Like, you're right. And like the willingness to like look at it and say, okay, how do I pivot from this place?
Yeah. I've made it very clear to them that I am not perfect and I have screwed up more times than I've gotten it right. So, and I'm not going to be perfect in my, journey of motherhood. There's no freaking manual. And honestly, what I've noticed is a lot of times when I'm frustrated or acting out, I'm expecting them to do something that I don't even know how to do. Right? Like, I'm expecting them to get it together and to stop, doing this or that, when if I were to look in the mirror, I'm not modeling that. I don't know how to, 100% of the time manage my emotions and cope with the way that I'm feeling and
Right.
handling things that are uncomfortable. And so I want them to know that, I'm not getting it right. I don't expect you to get it right, but we need to be honest with each other and with ourselves.
Right.
Especially me as the mom. I'm the parent.
Right.
Right? Can't expect them to do something we don't know how to do.
Sure. I mean, because you're leading by example at that point, right?
Yeah.
And, and as you allow yourself to be human and kind of like give voice to the different emotions that you're feeling, it opens up a place of safety for them to be able to fully express as well.
Yeah.
And so as we think about or become aware to like the feeling body, right? So again, like the soma first, like the body knows before the mind does a lot of the times. Like we, if we're actually tuning into all of our senses, which I want to talk a little bit about disassociation because I lived it most of my life.
Yeah.
Right. And it's hard for people to actually tap into, oh my gosh, like there's something showing up in my body and maybe it's a little bit of anxiety. And I felt it last night. We watched a psychological thriller and it was like the anticipation and I could feel my body shaking. And it's like, oh my God, what is that? Right. Yeah. Before I could even like have it in my thoughts or place words on it, I could feel this sense of like, oh my gosh, I'm like anticipating the world to fall apart in the movie. Right. And so just recognizing that, and it takes time and it's a skill, right? Especially when we've been taught to like look to our phones, to look externally, to like get validation from the outside. Yeah. And so
ignore.
Most of us have been doing that through this process of disassociation where we're not touching back into our heart, to our body, to our divine knowingness, right? And our ego is attempting to keep us safe,
right,
in some ways. So how do we do this? We do disassociation through drinking and drugs and sex and porn and shopping and social media.
Being busy, workaholic. I mean, anything you're doing without awareness, to, anything you're doing just for the sake of doing.
Yeah.
And without awareness.
Right. And I think the question really comes back to like, who are you being when you're doing those things?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, who am I being when I was like going to get my LSATs and trying to go to law school? It was like I
Yeah.
was being somebody I thought my parents wanted me to be, not like actually being the uniqueness of Lauren, who's also of service, right? Like, I could see myself doing service in law, but like, I've mentored foster kids. Like, I love children. Like, that's what brought me joy, and like, and also allowed me to operate from a place of joy instead of like showing up out of obligation.
Yeah.
Right. And so, in a lot of times, what I've witnessed and experienced myself is, like, you land up on a hamster wheel, doing the things. It's like Groundhog's Day. Like, you show up, you do them over and over again, which is why we're so limited in our capacity to feel, because we haven't even explored anything outside of like the parameters of our obligations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I had a really powerful experience with this with a therapy one time, and it was the dots connected in a way that I was kind of shocked about. But I am a to-do list person, and it is endless.
Yeah.
Like, the list is never done. There's always more getting added to it. And my therapist was like, what would happen if for a whole weekend you stayed home and you didn't do anything on the to-do list? Like, you had no responsibility. Like, you let everything else get handled. And I started to feel myself, like my heart started to race, like my chest felt tight. And I'm like, I can't do that. And he's like, why? I can't do that. I couldn't give him a reason why. But what ended up being uncovered for me is that if I'm not doing these things, then I am not valuable. I do not provide value. What's the point of me? Mm-hmm. I was not seeing the intrinsic value of me just because I'm here.
Right.
I had to be doing something in order to be valuable. And that kind of uncovering brought up a really raw emotion that I wasn't allowing myself to feel, right? Or I was numbing it by being busy.
Right.
Instead of working with the fact that, like, for whatever reason, I have this feeling. Mm-hmm. And I gotta work with that. I gotta see where that comes from. Where did I create this belief?
Right.
So that I can heal it and create a new belief or new truth.
Right. Yeah. Well, and then the first step to all of that is awareness. Awareness. Like, there's usually, I mean, I think that we continue to talk about this. Like, there's usually the thing behind the thing. Mm-hmm. And if you really ask, like, there's this practice of inquiry where you get asked why. Yeah. Right. And you just keep getting asked why, like 50 times. I remember the first time I did it, I was like, these people are nuts. I'm going to punch this bitch in her face.
Yeah. Like,
stop asking me the question, right? But really, it helped me start to uncover the thing behind the thing, behind the thing, behind the thing, behind the thing.
Yes.
Which opens up and unlocks, like, this whole other place that maybe you haven't been willing to explore. So it's like, if I'm drinking every time I go out, why am I doing that? Well, because it gives me confidence, right? And if you ask me why again, well, why? Well, because I'm an empath. Well, why? Well, because I feel really big. Well, why? Right? And I keep going there, and I go there, and I go there. And ultimately it comes down to, because I don't feel comfortable.
Right.
Right? Why? Well, because I want to belong. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Yeah. Okay, well, why don't you feel like you belong? Right? And it's like, well, because I've had to prove myself.
Right.
My entire life. And so it's easier to disassociate than to go there. Right? And so now it's like, holy cow, we're finding the keys to Pandora's box that's like buried all the way in the back of the closet.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really, when you were just talking about that, I was thinking typically a really good indicator for me that I'm getting somewhere is I start to feel myself getting really uncomfortable and I almost like irritated.
Yeah.
Like you're poking the bear. You don't ask me that. That's going to make me have to feel something that I don't want to feel.
Yeah.
That's going to bring up something that, and not even in my conscious mind, but my body starts to feel it. And then my emotions follow that. Right. So I start to feel that stress, that chest, my heart beating fast, because it is obviously it's an unsafe thing for you to be digging up whatever you're trying to dig up in me.
Yeah.
But we don't heal unless we do that.
Right. And we perceive it to be unsafe. Is it actually
perceive it to be unsafe?
Is it actually unsafe? Like maybe there's trauma here that needs to be unburied with the support of a professional, right? There's definitely like aspects of that can exist.
Yes.
And you know, I heard this quote from Alex Hormozy like last week or the week before, but as he said, fear is a mile wide and an inch deep. It feels really big and long, and like you can't get around it, right? You can't, but if you actually try and go through it, it's only that deep.
Yep.
Right. And so then on the other side, we start to uncover again, like the magic, the hidden gems, the power that we actually have as human beings in this lifetime, in this time-space reality that we've forgotten.
Everything we want is on the other side of fear.
Amen.
Nobody gets to live in this life without experiencing that.
Right.
And the people who are living lives or experiences or existences that we look at like, wow, that's for people like them. That's not for people like me. It's just that they have not stopped when they've experienced the fear or the rejection. They have continued to do it despite the fear.
Yeah.
And continue to step forward and into it. Because we'll feel that. We just have to know how to work through it, how to calm our nervous system back down, and how to continue to move forward.
Yeah, and use it for fuel in some ways, right? It's like it's just another aspect of energy. And energy gets to be in motion. And how do we move through this in a way that supports us to connect to our higher selves? And so there's really like two aspects of us, right? There's a story of the wolf, right? There's the dark wolf and the white wolf, and which wolf are you going to feed, right? Am I going to fear the dark wolf, which is like my negative thoughts, or am I going to fuel the white wolf, which is like my positive things, like my higher self? And so if we think about this in aspects of our human experience, like there's the ego, right?
Yep.
And that is here to help keep us safe, right? So fear is natural. There's a tiger. Fear helps us to run when we were in the caveman days, right? Right? So fear can be supportive in that regard.
Right.
To keep us safe. However, fear has been dictating us in ways beyond what it was actually originally meant to do, right? And so there's a man I was watching the other day, and he talks about like ego, EGO, right? Earth guide only. It is literally here to be our earth guide. And then there's our higher self, which is actually our soul's purpose, our soul's calling, like the thing that's probably led you to us, to be quite honest, because there's something in you that knows that life gets to be more than what I've created up until this point.
Yep.
Right? And then there's always another evolution. Like even when I feel like I've gotten through the fear, there's another layer. It's like an onion. It's constantly peeling itself back. And it's like, oh, I got over my belonging. But then there's a different aspect of like, oh, there it is showing up again. And how do I evolve my belonging at this deeper level of things? And so, you know, you get to ask the question when you hear those voices inside your head or whatever it is that's dictating you to feel a particular way, is like, is this actually for my highest version of myself, or is this my earth guide talking?
Yeah. Michael had a really good analogy one time, my husband, about that experience, right? Because it's about the journey. We have to learn to embrace the journey because we're not going to arrive. Like there's always going to be another layer.
Yeah.
And he used the analogy of a video game, the Mario Brothers.
Yeah.
Right? You start off in the beginning of each level and it's pretty easy, and it gets harder as the level goes on, and then you got boss mode, and it's like the hardest, obstacle yet.
Yeah.
And then you conquer that obstacle and you get to the next level and it's easy again until you get to the next boss level.
Yeah.
And you got to keep beating the boss level. And each time you beat the boss level, and maybe you don't beat it the first time. Maybe you go through your 3 lives and you got to start back over at that level again.
Yeah.
Maybe you got to start back over at the beginning and work your way back up. But there's always, like, once we break through what is the ceiling of that level and get to expand and go to the next level, like each is a layer of expansion and opening and awareness that we didn't know until we conquered that boss level. But I love that analogy, and it's so relatable.
Yeah, totally. I mean, We are. This is the game of life. The question is, how do you want to play it?
Yep.
How do you want to experience it? And we're here to, my teacher would say, and there's aspects of me that believe, like, there are souls that are waiting to get on this planet. We're here. Like, how do we actually be in the fullest experience of it? And that requires experiencing the emotions that are available to us too. And so, we've talked about inquiry being a tool. We've talked about, the analogy of the game and playing the game, self-reflection. Tell me about what helped you open up to a different level of feeling. Is there any tools that you would share with our listeners?
Really, for me, the only thing in the beginning that helped me open up to what I was feeling is to sit in stillness and to ask myself. And even if I didn't know, then I would say, well, if you did know, what would it be? And the answers, it's really interesting because when you talk about like the inner voice, not the inner critic, not the ego, but like the highest self voice that speaks the truth within you, it will speak if you are quiet enough to listen. And when I have been persistent and consistent about sitting in quiet, all of those things come up. So just sitting, breathing, it doesn't have to be a long time. It could be 2 minutes, could be 5 minutes, whatever you have time for, and just asking yourself, checking in. Maybe you're just setting an alarm on your phone for 3 times a day and just breathing for a second and saying, how am I feeling? What am I feeling? How does it feel in my body? And in that practicing awareness of that, we get better at understanding what we're feeling, and then we see it. We feel it.
I love that. I mean, the key is awareness. So how do you create the time and the space for that? For me, it was definitely coaching. Coaching opened up. I mean, I've gone to therapy, and we talked about this the other day too. Like, talk therapy is one thing, but like the somatic practices of like being in the experience of my body and actually like consciously choosing the emotion that I was willing to look at and relate to was really supportive. And then also being with somebody that knows, I mean, I've been with my coach for almost 7 years now. So she knows me better than most people know me and can call me out on my stuff. And so having somebody that you trust at that level of vulnerability to like actually allow yourself to be held, to experience things that may be frightening or unfamiliar is really a gift. That you can give yourself.
It is. Another thing that was really helpful, like to get past the next layer of that for me, was a therapy modality called internal family systems. I'm drawing a blank on who started that modality, but he also wrote a book called No Bad Parts, which is really good at helping to like describe what that process is and tapping in. And again, it really reminds me of the movie Inside Out and all the different parts that exist with us, and they're birthed because of our experiences that we have and defense mechanisms, and then but being able to talk to and work with all of those different parts of us that exist.
And part of it is like we remember to forget to remember, right? We're constantly walking each other home and coming back to the remembrance of who we are. And so as we were growing up, like you were saying, like, don't cry, I'll give you something to cry about. Like, we started to disown these parts of us because we were made or perceived to believe that it made us weak or vulnerable or all of these things. And so part of this process and awareness is this reclamation of self, the reclamation of the parts that we've disowned, and the feelings and aspects that we've made unsafe and covered with anger, or for me, sadness. And so the invitation for you is, one, of course, to check the resources out in below this podcast so that you can have a better understanding of all of the emotions that are available to you in this human experience and start to relate to them. But also to like just be with yourself in inquiry around, what's possible and what do you want to feel today.
If you've been listening along, you have heard me talk about the 7-day free awareness challenge that we have right now on our website and linked in the show notes. This is a workbook that offers a structured and gentle approach to cultivating mindfulness and self-awareness. So if you've never engaged in any of these practices before, this is a great place to start and kind of dip your toe in the water in a lot of different practices and modalities to help bring about more awareness. So each day, participants are introduced to a different practice, such as recognizing the power of choice, observing thoughts, and deepening awareness of emotions. This awareness challenge was designed to help us peel back the layers of societal conditioning and challenge participants to discover some of the hidden aspects of themselves that influence their daily lives. Activities include journaling prompts, reflection exercises, and mindfulness techniques that foster a deeper connection with the present moment. By completing the challenge, participants are going to identify patterns and be able to let go of some self-limiting beliefs and embrace a more peaceful and intentional way of living. If you have not yet downloaded the workbook, we hope you check it out and join us on this 7-day awareness challenge. Hope you've enjoyed today's episode on the Zen Curious. Thank you for joining us. You can find links to the resources we discussed today in the show notes. And if you want to connect with us further, you can find us on Instagram at the Zen Curious or leave us a comment and review. We'll see you next week.